Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures, Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Sunny Vanderstar. Today's topic is a Canadian subarctic summer, and it will be presented by our fabulous expedition leader, Eleanor Edye. Eleanor, thank you so much for being here today. I'm looking forward to this presentation, as I'm sure all of our viewers are, so I'll hand it right over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sunny, and thank you all for being here today on what is for me a very, very blustery, blizzardy day. And as I was preparing this presentation the last little bit, I was thinking to myself how much I was looking forward to summer, particularly summer in Churchill. Those of you who have maybe heard me speak before or perhaps even traveled with NatHab and might have seen me there, you might know already that I am one of our Canadian guides and that I spend a lot of my year in the Churchill region while guiding as an expedition leader with natural habitats. And as we start getting into this April, May time of year and the birds are starting to flock up and head north, all I can think about is how much I want to be in Churchill in the summer. So thank you all for joining me today on my public love letter to Churchill in the summertime. So through the next hour or so, I want to take you through some of my favorite parts of Churchill in the summer. And if you're thinking about traveling up with us this year or in future years, to learn about some of the landscape and environments of Churchill, as well as some of the species that we might find when we head up there and what makes them so very special. So to start with, I'd like us to be able to locate Churchill because we hear about Churchill a lot when we think about wildlife tourism especially. And if you've ever paged through a NatHab catalog, you might see that the Churchill trips actually take up a fair chunk of what we do as a company because there is so very much to see there in Churchill. So of course, Churchill is located in Canada. It's pretty close to the center of Canada longitudinally. So from east to west, it's pretty well close to the middle. And then it's about a third of the way up. So right on the shores of Hudson Bay, around 800 miles or so north of the US border. That center map there shows you the rail line map because Churchill is not a very accessible or easy place to get to. There are no roads which lead to Churchill. All roads lead to Rome. No roads lead to Churchill. You have to get there either by rail or by plane. Most people choose to travel by plane because it is a very, very long rail journey. And if you're an adventurous soul, there are people who have hiked there or bicycled there or taken their motorcycle or snow machine there, or a few other souls who travel up by canoe or powerboat. So you really have to make an effort to get to Churchill, but I hope you'll agree with me that it is well worth the effort of getting there. If you've been here before with Natural Habitat or you paged through some of the catalogs, you might have seen the little maps that we have like there on the right-hand side. We get you there by plane, and then from Churchill, we travel around the area into some prime polar bear habitat, for example, during our polar bear trips, or out onto the bay when we're talking about our beluga trips, and I'll talk about all those different locations as we go along. Now, this is going to take us to a different map right away, showing us the ecoregions of North America. And I tried to zoom in here on some of our more northern regions of North America, and I still have that little yellow star there where Churchill is located. So Churchill has many reasons that it's a very interesting place, but one of the more interesting reasons that it is ecologically interesting, and interesting from a point of view of a person perhaps wanting to see as many species as possible, is that it's located at what we would call an ecological crossroads. So all those different colors that we see there on the map represent different ecoregions, regions where the predominant soil type and rock type and climate type and vegetation type are all different. So therefore supporting different species of plants and different species of animals and giving us a different climate type in all these regions. Now Churchill, if you can look at on your screen there, It has 3 ecoregions that reach up into the Churchill area. At the bottom right there, we have a lovely kind of mid-green there. That is the Hudson Bay Lowlands. And this is a very large, very flat, overwhelmingly treeless area that is, as you might imagine from the name, it's a set of very, very flat wetlands located very close to the Hudson Bay there. In this Hudson Bay Lowlands area, over a third is wetlands, and another third on top of that is actual standing water. So a very, very wet area. If we look to the west of that little yellow star, we come into what's called the southern Hudson Bay taiga, or the open woodlands. So this is the northern part of our North American boreal forest. Predominantly, you find a lot of, you do find trees. there is forest there, but those trees tend to be small. They tend to be very widely spaced. We still have a lot of wetlands through that area as well. But then when we head north into that kind of more grayish color there, which you can see does follow the Hudson Bay coastline down into the Churchill region itself, that is called the low Arctic tundra. So in the tundra area, we have no trees. We have very low, very cold adapted vegetation. And of course, in all these regions as well, we have the animals that are in these areas too that are different. Now, on top of those terrestrial habitats, we also have the marine habitat of Hudson Bay, and we have the freshwater habitat of the Churchill River and all of these standing lakes and ponds that we have there too. And to show you what that kind of looks like from the air, or what it would look like if you, when you fly over and land in Churchill, this next image that we have coming up here is that large wetland, the Hudson Bay Lowlands, which actually is the world's second largest wetland. It's very flat, it's very slow draining. It's underlain by a structure called permafrost, which is permanently frozen soil. And it's an area where the glaciers were present and the ice sheets around 4,500 years ago. They scraped the area, they pushed the land down, giving us that very flat, very depressed land that is still rebounding. So when we go out and we walk across or we travel across this area, we have a lot of very shallow ponds interspersed by peat, which is undecomposed vegetation. You'll note some of that brown color in the ponds as well. If you're wondering what that is, that's other undecomposed organic matter, primarily goose poop, because we'll talk about all the migratory birds that come up and use the area too. It's very, very, very good bird habitat through here. Now, the land that we have here, because the ice sheets were on this area only about 4,000 years ago, we don't have a lot of soil that has developed in this region. So to give you a sense, this image was taken close to the Hudson Bay coastline, just outside the town of Churchill. You can see the rock types, and you can see also how this is a path through a protected area. So park wardens have been making sure that people only walk along this path for the last 30 or 40 years or so. And you can see how quickly just the action of people walking has worn down the vegetation layer down there to what is some of the bedrock supporting the area. So already here we can see our predominant bedrock types. We have a lot of what's called glacial till, which is just all the rocks and stones and gravel that got picked up by the glaciers and churned around. And then as those ice sheets and glaciers melted, they just got dropped exactly where they were. So all of those kind of boulders that just sit out there and the gravel that sits there comes from that glacial action. It is a very, very young landscape for this reason. Again, because the ice sheets were there very frequently in geological time. This is our new emerging, still developing landscape, and we would call this, what we're seeing here, tundra. It's extremely beautiful. It's very, very sparse beauty, but it is incredibly beautiful, especially as we get closer into the looking at the plants of the area. So just to show you on a non-cloudy day what it can look like in the summer, this is the beach on the coast of Hudson Bay. At the beach, it is a fairly disturbed area, not so much by humans, but actually by tides and by the action of the tides, especially as ice is present on Hudson Bay through the winter and spring. Now, you can see here on the left-hand side that there's gravel and sand right by the beach itself. And as that land continues to rebound post-glaciation, we're going to see all of that land becoming colonized by things like what we can see here, the sea lime grass and sea purslane, scurvy grass, all those things that like to stabilize sand dunes, just like you might have where you are if you're in California or anywhere else with a coastline where you get that vegetation that moves in to stabilize the coastline. Now, I'm calling this a Canadian subarctic summer, and what does it mean when I talk about the subarctic? There are lots of different definitions for what the subarctic can be. My personal favorite one is looking at where the tree line exists. What is the tree line? The tree line is the line beyond which, when you travel further north, you will not find any trees. It's not a hard line, right? We can draw it on a map, but it's actually a transitional zone. In the middle of that transition, you're going to have fewer trees and then shorter trees, and then really short trees, and then no trees at all. But you can see, again, I put that little yellow star there where Churchill is. We can see that that green line of the tree line really swings fairly far south into the Churchill region. You do not need to go very far outside Churchill to hit a full forest. You also don't need to go very far north of Churchill to get into the tundra. Again, it's that transitional zone right on the edge of those different ecoregions there. We think that that tree line comes so far south there because of the presence of Hudson Bay really controlling some of the temperatures, especially through the winter. And that transitional zone, when we go move through that forest, it can also have this incredibly stark beauty to it. These trees are what we call flag trees, and you're going to see these all through the Churchill region. Anywhere that we can access by vehicle around Churchill is likely to have these stands of flag trees. And these trees are telling you, well, firstly, where north is, because all of the branches that face towards the northwest, where the predominant wind comes from, get too damaged by the snow and by the ice blowing and hitting the tree to actually continue any growth. So this is one of those typical forms that we can find along that transitional zone where it's not so cold that trees can't live, but it's miserable enough and cold enough that trees can't grow very well. And this can get pretty extreme. It's a really, really hard place for trees to make a living. Now, on the next image that's going to pop up in a minute here, you're going to see some trees in the background. So again, you see those flag trees behind. But if you look towards the foreground of the image, and depending on the size of your screen, this may be more visible on bigger screens, but all of that vegetation that's on the ground there are actually prostrate spruce trees. So if you've ever seen a spruce tree, or like you're looking at them right now in the background, those very upright Christmas tree-like forms, if you put those trees under extreme stress and you don't give them enough water and you give them too much ice and too much wind, they can actually grow in a horizontal fashion. So they're not getting the impacts from the wind and from the ice like they would if they grew above the snowpack. So this is a very typical form of that these spruce trees will take as they get to the very, very edge of their growing area. And if you were to come here in the winter, all of this would be covered by snow. So this is a very protected way for these trees to be able to grow. I'm going to throw up a climate graph for the Churchill region. It's got a lot of lines on it. You don't need to worry too much. One thing I was going to point out here is that now we're in mid-April. Mid-April is right around when, on average, we see our daytime high temperatures cracking that freezing mark. So it really is just the start of spring for Churchill right about now. I think Churchill's actually warmer than, than it is at my house right now. Churchill does not get a lot of water, so it is a fairly dry area, but it's not a desert or anything like that. It still gets between 1 to 3 feet of snow on any given winter. Depends on the winter how snowy it's going to be. And it is a fairly breezy area. So consistently we see winds between that 11 to 16 knots. So those moderate breezes you can expect them on any given day. So it's windy, it's cool, it's moderately moist. Not a lot of frost-free days. So on average, we see about 70 days a year when we would have adequate growing conditions without frost. We see frost persisting well into May and into June. And we also see frost starting up usually by mid-August. So not a lot of days. If you like to garden in Churchill, you have your work cut out for you. And I would also expect that when you travel up, and if you were to travel up in early June or mid-June, you would still be seeing snow on the ground at that point. But as soon as that snow disappears, because the plants of the region only have that short growing season, they are ready to go as soon as that snow disappears. So even with those really, really rough growing conditions, there are over 500 species of vascular plants just within the Churchill area. So I obviously can't go through 500 plants all at once, so I picked out some of my favorites for you. This first one here, I think it's many people's favorites because it is the first one to come in the spring. It's called purple saxifrage. This is a circumboreal plant, so you find it all around in high Arctic and high alpine areas in Europe and Asia and North America. And it is known as the northernmost wildflower on Earth, as it's found on the northernmost piece of land on Earth. It can survive extremely cold environments, including environments where there's very little sunlight and very little water, and with only very, very brief growing seasons. As soon as that snow melts, it is ready to go. It has the buds ready to pop out as soon as the snow disappears, both the buds for their leaves as well as the buds for the flowers themselves. It grows very low to the ground, and all of the leaves that die annually don't fall off. They actually hold on to their dead leaves as well to help protect new growth. It traps windblown dust so they can also start building soil, and it also helps protect that new growth as it's coming out. So this is a very beautiful photo of purple saxifrage. I'm about to show you what it more often looks like when you find it on the ground. It's often very, very small and kind of sad looking. So this one here, I took this photo a few years back. I was so happy to find saxifrage when I was up in Churchill birding a few years back. So what this is growing on is a sandy berm. So if you can make out the grains of sand in that image, imagine, like, scale yourself down here. This is a very, very small plant we are talking about. The entire clump of this plant would be quite a bit less than at the size of a quarter in diameter. So you can see the plant itself growing with one sad little flower on the top. It will grow probably 2 leaves in a year. This one little plant here is probably at least 20 years old. So they do well for themselves. It is a plant that's very well adapted to these subarctic regions and the struggles that it faces. But this is really giving you a sense about how difficult life is and how many adaptations you need to survive in these areas if you're a plant. Now, it's not the only plant we have there by far. Purple sassafras is one of the first. One of the first ones that we see really carpeting the area is in late June and early July. This is called Arctic Avens, and it is a little tiny sunflower. So here we are talking now about, there's an ant on this flower per scale, but if I were to kind of describe it in terms of the size of coins, I would say this whole flower is now about a quarter size across, instead of the whole plant clump being a quarter across. Now these flowers will actually track the movement of the sun across the sky during the day. It's called heliotropism, so it turns to face the sun. Now, most plants that turn with the sun are actually turning away from the sun because it heats up the flowers too much when they get too hot. But when you're in the subarctic, you want that extra energy, you want that extra warmth. So it will actually follow the sun during the day, creating this lovely warm pocket for insects like their pollinators to visit. as well as helping those plants develop faster because they're getting that extra energy. Now, there are many pollinators in Churchill. You can see one of them here on the plant. So ants do act as pollinators. We do have a lot of mosquitoes, we have flies, but we have bumblebees too. These are my favorites. My favorite flying insects in Churchill are the Bombus polaris. So this is the Arctic bumblebee. It's one of 2 bumblebees that you can find in the Canadian Arctic. Unfortunately, the other one that you can find is actually a parasite of this one. So they do get on each other's nerves a little bit, I think, but it has many adaptations to living in cold temperatures. It's got a very thick coat of hair, and it will actually hibernate for about 9 months a year. Up in the top left corner there, you can see that we, a few years back, Canada put out a commemorative stamp for our Arctic bumblebees, and I do hold on to a few of those because I like that image so very much. Now, you may be surprised to hear that we also have a number of orchid species in the Churchill area. The one I threw up here is the largest of our orchids. This is called Franklin's Lady Slipper, and it's about a foot tall, more or less, at maturity. There are 8 species of orchid in the area, of which 2 or 3 of them are what we call saprophytic or parasitic, so they don't have any green parts. Using their fungal mycorrhizae, they are able to collect energy and sugars and nutrients from other plants in the area. They're beautiful. If you've never seen an orchid that sits only about 3 inches high, you do have to get down on your hands and knees to fully appreciate it, but they are just as beautiful and perfect when they're small as when you see a very large, showy orchid too. One of the favorite plants that many people in Churchill have, as well as many of our people who travel up to visit Churchill, is fireweed. And depending where you personally live, you may already have fireweed where you live. We do have the common fireweed up in Churchill. If you have fireweed in some of the more southern latitudes, the common fireweed is probably the exact same plant that you have out by you. So it's one of the most widespread plants in the Northern Hemisphere. The seeds last a very long time and they wait for disturbance. So we see fireweed primarily on like newly cut roads, on freshly burned areas, anywhere where we've had a lot of disturbance, but they also can find little tiny pockets. So even areas where, for example, a goose has come in and pulled up some sedges to eat the roots, well, there's probably a fireweed seed there waiting for that little disturbance for it to grow as well. And they make the fireweeds come out in late July, early August through mid-August. It's one of the last flowering plants in the Churchill area to remain through the late summer, and they make an absolutely gorgeous backdrop for all kinds of photography. And there's been a few people over the years who have gotten lucky enough to have a polar bear shot in the fireweed, and I don't think that there's anything more I could personally achieve for as a photographer than to get a polar bear in fireweed. Now, flowers are great. Just a note that for many folks in town, as well as those of us who like to visit, flowers are great, but the berries that some of the flowers make are even better. And there are many, many different kinds of edible berry in the Churchill region. This is a very common one that you're going to see as you walk around. It's called crowberry. And the mature berries are those kind of purplish, bluish berries in the middle there. And they are about the size of your pinky fingernail, right? So they are actually worth getting down there and picking. They're not very tiny at all relative to the size of the plants. They're eaten by birds, they're eaten by mammals, including us, and similar to fireweed, their seeds remain viable quite a long time, so they move well into new areas as well. Very popular kind of plant and berry. Now, just to come back to some of the talk about trees for a minute, to wrap up around trees, we do have a number of trees in the Churchill region. The predominant species that we have is one called white spruce. And white spruce is the one that we find closest to the actual tree line. So it prefers the area where it's drier, where they have a little bit more stress in that way. And that's me in that picture pointing at what looks like a piece of wood there, right? This picture was taken in the same area as before, where we were looking at with those very prostrate, horizontally growing trees, to show you what the tree trunk of that set of trees actually looks like. We think of old trees mostly being big trees. But when trees are under a lot of stress, whether it's moisture stress or other climate stress, they can grow very, very slowly. So this tree that I'm pointing at here that's very spread out actually does have a trunk, but the trunk's growing sideways. And we're probably looking at a 300 to 400 year old tree, even though it doesn't come up above my knees. And I think that that's pretty darn cool. Where those trees grow sideways, they actually can't produce cones. They are only able to reproduce asexually by cloning themselves. But as we get further into the forest, you'll see that cones come up. They're not produced every year, but they do provide good food source for small animals like squirrels and birds. Now, I did say that there were over 500 species of vascular plants. I'm not going to take you through all the species of non-vascular plants, but rest assured they do exist as well. They're not always as showy, but the lichens and the mosses that are found in that area are also really important ecologically. This one that's up on the screen right here is called Cladonia Ranjafarina. You may know it by its name as reindeer moss or caribou lichen, or some combination thereof. It's one of many lichen species that are consumed by caribou. Lichens are, of course, a symbiosis between fungus and algae. The fungus provides the structure, the algae provides carbohydrates through photosynthesis, and it is a very, very critical food source for caribou. Adult caribou will actually eat between around 10 to 15 pounds of this every day throughout the winter. So that is you don't know until you pick it up. This is light stuff. So they are eating a lot of this throughout the winter. So let's move on from the plants, as much as it hurts my heart to move on from plants because I love them so much. But I want to make sure we have time to talk about the other things that actually move around too. Starting off with some of the birds that you might see in the summer. Now, this guy here, I bet you know what this is. Of course, it is a raven. And it is one of the very few year-round resident species of birds that are found in Churchill. It is by far the most abundant and evident. And even if you were up in the winter, you would have seen this one because it's one of the few birds that is still there. And it is the only bird that has been recorded every year in the Christmas bird count in Churchill. Other birds you might see through the year include gray jay, willow ptarmigan, house sparrow, hoary redpoll, the rock ptarmigan, and the gyrfalcon. And that is it for winter birds. But as we start getting into that melt time of year through April and May, close to 300 species of migratory birds will come to Churchill for the long summer days, for the abundant food, and for those prime nesting areas. So a lot of folks come up hoping to see some cool birds, and there are cool birds galore out there. Now, this particular one here is actually present through the winter, but they're easier to spot in the summer and spring. This is a willow ptarmigan. Specifically, it is a male willow ptarmigan in breeding form. So he's got his little combs above his eyes there that are inflated. He's got a brown head and neck, and if you could see through the willows here, you'd see he had a white body. So if you're a female willow ptarmigan, this is what you're looking for. Very showy bird relative to what they look like the rest of the year when they really blend into the landscape. These birds will feed on the willows themselves, both the buds as well as the flowers that come up through the year. Now, the first migrator that comes to Churchill, though, is the snow goose. And these come up in great big flocks. They arrive usually late April or early May, so we're getting to that time of year already. And they're unfortunately very destructive to the landscape. They feed in these huge flocks that they have, feed in huge amounts on that summer vegetation. So they will actually put their beaks right into the soil and grub around to feed on the roots. And that really turns over the landscape, and there's a lot of disturbance associated with the snow goose. So to give you an idea on numbers, just in Wapusk National Park, which is a national park just to the east of Churchill, there are 15 million snow geese that come up every spring to stage and feed. And in high density areas where there are a lot of snow geese altogether, in half a square mile, there may be up to 3,000 nests. So a lot of birds, a lot of nests, a lot of feeding going on. These geese are really important to the other animals of the area because not so much the geese themselves, but the goslings and the eggs are important food sources for animals like foxes, both Arctic foxes and red foxes, for other birds that are predatory like yagers and gulls, and also for wolves and bears of the area too. Now, this next bird, some of you may know, it might fly over your head during its migration. This is the Arctic tern, which does have the longest migration of any animal. It goes from summer to summer, and they have a minimum 12,000-mile migration annually. And they track many of these birds, and because they travel from Antarctica to the Arctic every year, and of course most birds don't go in a straight line, we know that many of these birds actually go many more miles than this and log upwards of 40,000 miles annually. Just blows my mind every time. So they have about a 30-year lifespan. Keep in mind that during their 30-year lifespan, they will travel on their own power, the equivalent of flying to the moon and back. Crazy stuff. They are charming birds in their own way. They mate for life. That's charming. They take care of their babies. And they are quite defensive. We know that here you can see a bird on a nest site coming up right away. So their nests don't seem like a lot. They will actually just find or create a little depression in some sand or gravel. But both parents do care for the nest and the hatchlings. And by late summer, the young will be ready to migrate themselves. Now, I did mention that they were defensive of their nest, yes? So we're seeing here an example of a classic Churchill tool if you want to go for a walk along the beach. You carry a big stick so that the birds swoop down and go for the stick instead of for your head. So lots of fun time with these terns. They're just doing their very best to take care of their babies. Now, other shorebirds that we might find in the area too, I think this one is probably the prettiest one. Don't tell the tern I said that, but this is the American golden plover. Churchill is right at the edge of their breeding zone, so they mostly breed actually up in the high Arctic, but we see golden plovers every year in the Churchill region. They migrate from Central and South America up for the summer and then back down again in the fall. They forage for food on the tundra, the beaches. They eat insects primarily, as well as small crustaceans, as well as feeding on some of those berries like the crowberries we were talking about. Another common migratory shorebird that you might see is called the lesser yellowlegs. Yes, there is also a greater yellowlegs, but we see more of the lesser ones around Churchill. So it does breed in Churchill. It's always funny to see it because it is a shorebird. We see it primarily kind of grubbing around in the mud and in the sand, looking for insects and small crustaceans. But they actually perch on those trees in defense of their nest sites. So they nest similar to how terns do in very open areas, just shallow depressions on the ground. But to better be able to sight what's happening and to yell at you so you go away, they will go up and perch on these trees like this. Like one of the favorite birds of many people in Churchill is this one here. This is the tree swallow. And one of the reasons it is a favorite for people is that it is what's called an aerial insectivore. So it will swoop around in the air, catching flying insects as it goes. And it can eat quite a few insects every day. Churchill is actually at the very, very northern limits of its range, where it's limited by nest site availability. As you might figure from its name, the tree swallow, they like to nest in trees, and we don't have many big trees, especially big hollow trees in Churchill. But this is one of the best studied one of the best studied bird species in the area, and there have been many, many nest boxes set up where every single individual who is born is banded, and this is done as a research project through a researcher at the University of Jamestown. These are some of the hatchlings that you can see there in the hands as they're being banded. So they are very well studied and very well appreciated as they swoop around to catch those insects for us. Anytime that you've got small birds flying north, you will likely also have birds that feed on those birds going north as well. So there are raptors that migrate to the Churchill area as well. We commonly see golden eagles, bald eagles, and both of those will actually nest in the area too. Osprey, gyrfalcon, hawk owls, red-tailed hawks, rough-legged hawks. We see these swooping around and taking birds down with regular occurrences. Now, birds are not the only thing on the landscape making noise. One of my favorite things when I'm up in the summer is to crack my window open through the night and listen to the sounds of the tundra. And one of my favorite sounds of the tundra is listening to this little frog here. This is the boreal chorus frog, which is, it's a type of tree frog, and it sings. As you might take from the name, the boreal chorus frog is a very loud, very vocal species. It's very much at the end of its distribution in our area in Churchill, but they are present through the area and you can hear them through the summer months too. So what are the other things that we might see? Well, I can show you the Arctic fox. The Arctic fox will of course feed on those frogs, it will feed on those birds, it will feed on those birds' eggs. And this is an Arctic fox in the summer. If you've seen ever Arctic foxes in, for example, images during a polar bear tour, they would likely have their full winter coat on, which is pretty well pure white. But in the summer, they lose a lot of their hair thickness and they change to this color here, which is that kind of mid-range brown, and it varies how dark and how light each pelt is. They're the only member of the dog family who change their color of pelt. So they will be breeding right about now and giving birth in the next couple of months or so. They do mate for life, and they den in well-drained, slightly higher elevation areas, and they tend to reuse their dens year over year over year. Some of, over a century, those same dens will be reused. Their population numbers are really interesting. They fluctuate quite a bit depending on where the lemming cycle is at, but they feed on other things as well, as mentioned, like the birds, the eggs, as well as voles, berries, even ring seal pups. And of course, in turn, they also provide food for eagles and owls and red foxes too. They are, I think of all the foxes though, they are one of the more charming, charming kinds of foxes, but the red fox, pretty good looking as well. You likely have red fox where you live right now. They are the widest distributed carnivore in the world, and they're up to about 1.5 times the weight of the Arctic fox. They also breed right around now, ready to take advantage of that summertime abundance to raise their pups. So as all the birds are in the area, laying their eggs, raising their chicks, that is a great time to be able to take those eggs and take those chicks and take the birds so that you can feed your pups. These foxes are less well adapted for the Arctic themselves. We find them more in the southern regions of Churchill. They prefer areas where they can den further into the ground, where it's a bit more protected. So they're quite limited by the den sites And Churchill, again, being on that zone between the Arctic and the boreal, sees both species of fox at all times of year. Whoops. Now, I think one of the more exciting and really unusual animals that you might see is actually a caribou. We don't see these every year, but they do sometimes range into the Churchill area. The Cape Churchill caribou herd, which is around 3,000 individuals, will travel different ways and they use different summering grounds. Some years, the summering grounds includes the Churchill region, and you might see one or more individual caribou out there on the landscape. This next photo was actually taken in Wapusk Park in late summer. One of the ways caribous are unusual is that they're the only member of the deer family where both males and females grow antlers. So males drop their antlers after the rut, which is in the fall. This image here was taken in the late summer, so that full rack of antlers is going to be a male right there, whereas females will grow their antlers through the fall and keep them until after they give birth in June. Those caribou have what's called synchronous calving, so they migrate to the same general area, they give birth at the same time, and the idea behind that is to be able to overwhelm predators. The expectation is that some calves will be lost because wolves know it's time to go eat as well, but that the majority of the calves will survive because wolves cannot take every single calf. Now, I'm going to show you a photo here with snow, but don't be afraid because this can happen through the early summer as well. This image was taken from the Assiniboine Park Zoo in southern Manitoba as part of their annual seal survey. Summer in Churchill can still mean ice, but in Churchill, sea ice cover is seasonal, meaning that at some point in the summer, all the ice is gone from Hudson Bay, and at some point in the winter, the Hudson Bay is pretty well fully iced over. Now, in May and June, as we get a lot of sun, but still ice, this is when seals will haul themselves out of the water and onto the ice to sun themselves and also go through a molt. They're really quite charming animals. We see them swimming through the water in the summer looking like this. They will also haul out on rocks. Now, summertime, if you're a seal, is a pretty good time. It is a fairly low stress time for you. You can still catch lots of fish, but you are less likely to be caught yourself. Now, if you're a ring seal, your main predator is the polar bear, and a ring seal can outswim a polar bear. Polar bears are really only able to effectively hunt ring seals when there is an ice platform for the polar bears to hunt from. But we do see bears sometimes in the summer as well. Because that ice cover is seasonal, as that ice cover disappears and shrinks, bears will start coming off the ice and moving to shore, and most will swim there and spend their summer really just hanging out and being lazy. They come off depending what the ice cover is like, and some years most bears will be off the ice by mid-June if the ice is breaking up very quickly. Some years we don't see a lot of bears on land until late July or even early August if that ice cover is still present on the bay, because those bears still want to be out on the ice hunting as long as they can. Females with cubs usually come off first because they don't want to swim too far with their cubs. Males will remain on the ice a little bit longer because they're more tolerant of that potential longer swim to shore like that. Now, during the summer, they sometimes swim around, but really summertime is usually a time for bears of resting and waiting for the ice to come back. So when we spot bears in the summer, it may be when they're swimming, certainly, but more likely it's just going to be a bear that's curled up, potentially dug into a daybed where it can reach down to some of that cooler soil underneath, just hanging out, staying out of the way of other bears and waiting for that ice to come back. Now this bear you can see is not staying out of the way of other bears. That's because she is a mom with cubs. The cubs will probably keep her moving around because cubs don't like to stick around too long, just like human kids who don't have a tolerance for sitting. Polar bear cubs don't always as well either. So there's a cub poking his head up while the mom's trying to rest. And the next image there is going to show you one of the cubs laid out across the ground as well, just enjoying that summer sunshine. While they're on land, like I said, they're likely going to rest. They may also do things like they may eat berries, they may eat kelp that has washed up onto the beach. And if a bear has gotten very, very lucky indeed, it may find a deceased beluga whale that has washed up on the shore as well. Because I think my favorite summer visitor, as well as most of our favorites, would be this last summer visitor here, which is, of course, the beluga whale. They're really something special, you guys. They are, they're in the family Monodontidae, which means single-toothed whale, along with the narwhal. So it is a very Arctic adapted whale. They don't have a dorsal fin because they don't want to be brushing it up against the ice. There's a worldwide population of around 200,000, but right in the Churchill River estuary, we see around 3,500 every year. They're found in packs, pods of up to around 10 individuals. But in the summer, they come into these coastal areas and into the estuaries, and they aggregate into these much larger amounts. So the again, look for the little star coming up on this map right away, showing you where Churchill is, because it's showing you here the migration route of the Western Hudson Bay population of beluga whales. The whole Western Hudson Bay has around 40 to 60,000 individuals. And again, remember in Churchill, we have around 3 to 4,000, but they will actually overwinter further north up in the Hudson Strait area and then come, I mean, I was gonna say May or June, but really again, it's all dependent on the ice. As soon as there is sufficient open water for them to travel, they will travel down and end up in the Churchill River estuary. And I've been in Churchill in mid-June, and I've looked at the water and thought, where are the belugas? It's all ice. What are they going to do? And literally hours after the ice broke up and the river started flowing, the whales were there already. So they come in very quickly, again, usually starting with the males because they're more tolerant to moving through ice-covered areas, but then the females with the juveniles will show up very quickly as well. It's really something else to see, and somebody once described it to me by a way that's really stuck with me as one of the great wonders of the world, the great natural wonders of the world, because you can be out there sometimes in a boat and you can look in almost any direction and there are just whales. The whales will go where the whales want to go. They come into the estuary for things like feeding. So they feed on capelin, primarily in this area, which run up into the Churchill River. But they also feed on jellyfish and crustaceans, but they also come into the river to give birth. They don't mate here, but they do give birth in Churchill in those warmer, more sheltered areas. And just to be able to look out into that Arctic water and see these white shapes moving through the water is just, it's really otherworldly and just fascinating here. So the next image will show you kind of what it looks like from the water, because when we go out with NatHab, we're out usually on Zodiacs, but also sometimes in kayaks. This pod of whales that you're going to see in a minute here is a family pod, and I can tell that because of the colors of the whales themselves. At maturity, beluga whales will be pretty well pure whites. When they're born, they're quite dark in color, and as they mature, they lighten further and further. So those calves will remain with their mother through the nursing period, which is about a year, and then they'll be weaned fully by at least around 2, but they stay with their mom until they're fully mature around that 6 to 7 year old mark. Females may stick around with their mom for the rest of their lives. Males will branch off and join bachelor pods where other single males are, other mature males, I should say. Now, When we look at beluga whales, because they don't have that dorsal fin, they just have a ridge along their back, it really does look like a gentle roll through the water as they travel. And this whale is demonstrating one of the reasons that they come into the Churchill River. You can see that that whale is, okay, they're always beautiful, but this one is a little bit less beautiful than it will be in a few weeks because it is going through a seasonal molt. We can see that yellowish skin on top there. That is thick, heavily keratinized skin that they are going to go to the bottom of the estuary against the gravel ridges down there, rub that rough skin off, just like when you're going for a pedicure. And then when they come back up and that skin has sloughed off. So over the course of the early summer, they will go through that molting period, ending up that very pure, pristine white again by midsummer. The next photo, I just had to share it because it's one of my favorites that I've ever taken. It's showing you a newborn beluga whale. I can tell you that it's newborn because, well, because of its color. It's showing me that that very characteristic brand new whale color, and also because where it's riding, it's actually almost riding on top of its mom's flippers there, because she's helping raise it up every time it needs to take a breath, so it's being kept very close to the surface. Newborn whales will often stick their heads all the way out of the water as they're breathing, unlike mature whales, which usually just go through that rolling process and you don't see their face every single time. Quite adorable, in short. Now, I hope that that my enthusiasm for Churchill in the summer has come through, because I can't think of a better place to spend part of your summer than in Churchill. It is really one of my favorite places and favorite times of the year, and I hope that someday you will make it up there as well. And if not, that you've learned some things and gained an appreciation for this time. And with that, I will pass over to Sunny for questions.
Eleanor, thank you again. It was so fun to go back to Churchill with you. I've been fortunate enough to go up in the winter and see the polar bears, but I'm dying to get back in the summer. And in addition to the plants and animals in Churchill, I just want to put in a plug for the people. I absolutely loved the town of Churchill and the restaurants and surprisingly good food and just the friendly people. I absolutely loved the culture and the art and so forth. So there's so much more to Churchill than one might expect. Before we go on, I just want to remind people they can submit questions via the questions field in the control panel, but we do have a few to start with. The first one is that, you mentioned eagles. They typically build their nests in large trees. So where do they nest in Churchill?
Oh, they still nest in trees in Churchill. We just laugh at them a little bit while we see them. There are a few, I'm thinking very specifically of a handful of big tree stands where I see eagle nests, because you're right, they do prefer those large trees, but so they are restricted in where they can go in Churchill, but they do exist, and they are probably picking what you might not call a large tree, but is sufficiently large to support a nest, which is really all that bird needs. I will say that one of the times that I've laughed the hardest in my life was trying to see a bald eagle perch on a Churchill tree. It was a little flag tree, maybe about 6 feet tall. And bald eagles, they're very majestic looking most of the time. But seeing this bird just kind of bounce on a tree as it kept falling off was one of the funniest things I have seen in my life.
You mentioned how remote Churchill is, and we found it on the map. Will there be rail trips again through Nat Hab, or what's the situation there with getting to that remote area?
Yeah, I'm personally fortunate because I've had the opportunity over the last number of years to travel a lot for work, both by flight as well as by rail. And I know that Nat Hab previously did offer those rail trips, having been on those too. I can't speak for all the offerings that we may ever have in the future, but I can say, as somebody who has ridden those rails, that it is a fun, lovely experience, but you have to not care when you're getting to where you're going, because I joke about it sometimes, and I liken it to, you know, childbirth, right? You know where you're getting on, that you're going to get off at some point, but you don't know what's going to happen in the middle or what time it's going to end. And I have been a day late on that train. I have been on time, and I know that natural habitat really prioritizes maximizing the time on the ground. And while the train is really fun, ultimately you run a really big risk of losing out on time in Churchill. So we do prefer to do those flights. It makes for such a great experience in Churchill. And of course, the flights that we take to Churchill are charter flights as well. So you're not losing time in the airport, the security and screening and waiting around. We're just on the plane and off we go. And next thing you know, you're in Churchill.
It is smooth. I love the way they do it. What are the average temperatures in late July, early August? And when are the gnats and mosquitoes most prevalent?
Oh, okay. So I'll answer the second part first with the biting insects, because I know that I get questions about how the biting insects are, and my answer would always be the biting insects are great. You're going to see so many of them. You will leave having experienced such a great variety of biting insects. You'll be so happy with your trip, because if you think of all those wetlands, there's so much breeding habitat for those insects, and they are very, very important pollinators and bird food as well. We don't get those beautiful birds coming up without the insects. Now, as to when they appear, they come out usually about a week after snowmelt. So right around that mid-June time is when we start seeing insect emergence. And then by late July, they are pretty much done for the year. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, holy smokes, I want to go in July to see the belugas, what I would say is truly don't worry. Remember how I said how windy Churchill is? Like there's always that moderate breeze. That is enough to keep those bugs completely at bay. I actually personally, I don't wear bug spray. I don't wear bug nets. I don't do anything like that in Churchill, despite being somebody who reacts to bugs, because when we're out on the water, when we're out walking along the beach, you've got that really, really good wind that's going to be keeping those bugs at bay. The only time I might reach for a bug net or for insect repellents is if we're doing like early morning birding in the trees and there's no wind. In that case, yeah, there will definitely be some insects, but we have ways of mitigating that. Temperature-wise, if we're thinking July daytime highs will be somewhere, you know, it varies quite a bit, but we would say likely 60s to 70s if you're thinking Fahrenheit, mid-teens to the low 20s if you're going in centigrade. It's extremely variable though. And of course, we're there to see the whales, we're there to see whatever wildlife is there and the plants, and all of those are there even when you might have a cold, rainy day or a hot day. So honestly, whenever I'm packing for Churchill in the summer, I feel like I'm packing for 2 or 3 seasons at once, because I know that morning might be cold and afternoon might be hot, and layers are always the key to enjoying your time outside.
Excellent. Well, we've run out of time, but I want to squeeze in a real quick answer to this one because I know it's a real common one. Is there a good time period to come to Churchill and see both polar bears and belugas?
Okay, yeah, that's a great question, and you might even round it out with saying, "Can I see northern lights as well?" Because that's what really brings people to Churchill. And yes, we've had it happen. There are possibilities of seeing kind of all of those big ticket items on a single trip. What I would advise people to do is like pick some of those later season dates that we have if you're really prioritizing seeing as much as possible. Keeping in mind that as we go later in the season, what you will not have as much of is the juvenile belugas, because they come in and they will start their trip back up north before the males do. There are still lots of belugas through July and August, but we lose out on those juveniles during the course of the summer. The more likely you are to see bears, the later it is. So seeing bears in early July, not impossible, but quite unlikely. Seeing bears in late July or early August, I would say you've got a decent chance, if you're willing to put the work in to go looking for them, of finding bears. I would say the same thing as well with northern lights, because we're limited by the long daylight in the summer. The later you come in the summer, like into August, the more likely you are of potentially also getting to see the aurora on the same trip.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. I'll just turn it over to you for closing comments.
Thank you very much. And I just wanted to say thank you to all of you again for coming and listening to my love letter to Churchill and summertime. I just can't wait to be back up there. And I really hope that I brought you a piece of Churchill in the summer for this past hour, and that you might get a piece of it of yourself at some point in the future. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to getting up there sometime. I want to thank everybody who tuned in. Please join us again tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I'll conclude the webinar. Thanks, and have a great day, everyone.